Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And I want to thank each and every one of you who has been supporting this channel for the last couple of years. And I think before I introduce my wonderful guest today, I am going to ask those of you who are supporting me here, who have subscribed, to actually look for me on Rumble as well and follow me there too. Now, the reason being, I had quite a scare last week when I got an email from the lovely runners, people who run this platform, telling me that the algorithm had picked up that this channel was a scam and that it was going to be taken down immediately. No warnings, no suspensions, just gone. At which point, of course, I panicked, thinking about the hard work of the last 2 years disappearing. So within an hour, it was very clear that a mistake had been made and they put the channel back on. But it got me thinking, as you might guess. So I have now got the same channel on Rumble, and it is there, and I will be putting the content that is on this channel on there also. And if ever I disappear, you know where to find me. And I will also be starting a Substack very soon. News on that to follow. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Kim Farnell. Hello, Kim.
Hello.
A bit of a preamble there, but I'm prone to forget things when I start talking to my guests, and I thought I'd better get that out of the way. So welcome, and you are here because, as usual, you have been delving into the quirkier side of astrology, and you gave a talk for the wonderful Brighton Astrology Circle entitled Tales of the Lost Astrologers, including the one who ran a brothel and the one who ran away to join the fair. And who could resist a title like that? I wanted to know more.
I started with it when I was doing research into horoscope columns, and I realised that the only way to work out the connections between columns in magazines was to look at the people who wrote them, because there are a lot of connections and patterns that you can't see if you just look isolated in magazines itself. Unfortunately, once I started looking at the people, it became very difficult to stop looking at the people. And it's turned into a major side project now because some of them are so interesting. And I've been compiling a whole set of stories. The ones I talked about, Brighton, that we'll talk about in a minute. Some of the highlights of that, but I've got something like 50 or 100, between 50 and 100 in different states of being now. They will eventually turn up in a book. But I'd mentioned it to Victor, who runs the Brighton group, and got told off for not sharing some of this. So hence the talk. And one night, in case I get run over by a bus tomorrow and no one knows the stories of these astrologers I've been digging up, we can have some of them on record. That's the point of it.
I just love it. I mean, I think it's fair to say that those of us who have discovered this wonderful art are not your average person, because we are interested in the things that the mainstream have kind of sidestepped, ignored, poo-pooed. And I think it does take a certain way of looking at the world to be interested in astrology. So
Yeah,
it
I
doesn't
think more,
surprise
more,
me.
more than that. Because I think it's one thing being interested and spending your spare time looking at it and doing charts and everything, which is all fine. But then to make it the major part of your life, so it's your work and all your friends are astrologers, you only mix with these sorts of people, and it surrounds everything you do. That's a slightly different sort of person, and those are more the type of people that I'd be looking at, the ones who are so firmly implanted in an astrological world, you can't really imagine them doing anything else.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I was thinking about, because to have an interest, as you say, is one thing, but when you are so immersed in it and not afraid to be out in the world with that persona, I think it's quite a different proposition. And I think particularly historically, now it's much easier, but there would have been a time in which people would have been very marginalized for being in this world.
Well, yes, that's true. But the other side of that is that people who are already marginalized for a variety of reasons found it a world that they could be very comfortable in. So it goes both ways. So there were people, I mean, for example, there's a very lengthy period where the employment prospects for women were minimal. And yet there were a lot of women who needed to work for whatever reason. Not all of them had someone to keep them. So they only had a restricted amount of things they could do to make money. And practicing astrology was one of those things. And that's been going on for a good, at least since the 17th century. Women have been doing that because they're either on their own, they never married, and they haven't got any family support, they need to make money, or their husband dies or runs away or whatever he does. Again, they need to make money. And you can only have so many cleaners. And and they might not have other skills. And a lot of them, they do other things as well. There's lots of stories about women astrologers in particular selling cosmetics on the side, for example, and doing other things. Some of them literally were cleaners or seamstresses or whatever, as well as doing astrology. But like today, people don't necessarily do one thing. But most of the people I've been looking at are the ones who are very focused and they are doing the one thing.
Well, I remember in the last conversation that we had, where we were talking about the sun sign astrology, um, how interesting it was to discover the number of women involved. And I think there is something of that stigma, that was there. It's so easy to attach it to something that women are interested in. A bit like, looking at things and going, oh, old wives' tales.
Yeah.
It's really, it is that, isn't it? But you're right. I think there is an adventurous spirit running through a lot of people who operate in this area.
Yeah, yeah. Because I remember last time as well, one thing that I mentioned is that, pardon me, there's a linguistic separation. For a long period, women who are doing astrology, um, weren't doing astrology. Those words it wasn't used like that. They were ruling the planets. Men did astrology. They were professors and doctors. Women, when we got to the late 19th century, could start being called madame instead of mother because they were classic fortune tellers, but they never got to be doctors or professors or any of the other honorary titles that the men took. So it's very easy to lose sight of them. They disappear in the history because if you search, say, if you were searching a newspaper database or something like that, and you search for astrologers in the 19th century, you'll primarily find men because the word astrologer wasn't used for a lot of women.
No, and interesting what you were saying there, where you were talking about the fortune telling side, because of course that is specifically what was actually forbidden and banned as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's always been difficult. It remains difficult. Where is the line? Where does it become fortune telling rather than astrology? And sometimes, does it matter? I mean, if it is fortune telling, is that a problem anyway?
Yes,
You know,
but if you've
so
got, but if
because
you've got
personally, I
women,
don't think so. I mean, I think you're allowed to do fortune telling as well. If you want to call it that, that's all fine and good. But I know that isn't a popular view amongst astrologers because it sounds too unrespectable.
It does. And again, if you add to that the fact that it's, seen as something that women do, it
Yeah,
it adds to that denigration of the subject, of the art, of whatever however you want to call it. It again, it's that denigrating
yeah,
of the status. So this is a status issue, really. So we have the respectable astrologers, and then we have everybody else. And the respectable astrologers have the higher status because they have the education. Therefore, they are more likely to be men. And then, of course, there's the women who are doing,
most of the
yeah,
astrology, that's
exactly.
the
Yeah.
vast majority. But I mean, you've actually edged quite nicely into the first person I was going to talk about, because there's a woman in the 18th century, a woman astrologer, who was hugely famous, and she was known. I think it was about it's several years after decades after her death. She was still being called the celebrated Mrs. Williams, in such a way that no more description was necessary. This is a long time after she'd gone. Everyone knew who she was. She called herself the celebrated Mrs. Williams, which is always quite a good idea. Find your own sort of title. But it was adopted happily by everybody. Raphael mentions her in his books, which is much later, they come much later. He talks about her as the celebrated Mrs. Williams. And he didn't need to explain who she was because, of course, she was the most famous astrologer of the late 18th century. She knew Ebenezer Sibley because if you ask someone for give me a famous 18th century astrologer, people would usually give you Sibley because there weren't actually a huge amount around that we know about now. So that's the name comes up. And yes, they knew each other. It's recorded them going to the same meetings so that they correspond. They definitely knew each other. But his name remains, hers doesn't. Like many other people, she didn't write, who are forgotten, she didn't write books. This is the problem. The ones we remember are the ones who've left books behind. But she was the celebrity, famous one of her day. And she was everywhere because she toured. So she'd go from London to Bath to Bristol or whichever seaside resort was fashionable at the time. And she would put adverts in the papers several weeks beforehand saying that she was about to arrive in town so people could book in advance and all this sort of. She had loads of clients. She had a staggered list of fees. So you could buy the full consultation where you paid quite a bit of money to go into the room and sit there with her for up to an hour where she went through your charts and full treatment. Or you could pay a small amount of a few shillings where she'd look at your sun sign and quickly give you a sort of quick run through of this sort of things likely to come up over the next year. So her audience, her clients, covered all classes, which itself was unusual because a lot of astrologers who became prominent, they aimed for a particular group. They were either usually handed to more upper class people because they're the ones with the money. And then when we get into the early 20th century, it's sort of with Alan Lear, they're aiming as a solidly middle class and lower middle class audience because they've got a bit of money, but they're not posh enough to be threatening. So it changed. But Mary Williams actually should see anyone as long as you could pay. And if you were one end of the scale, then you paid for the cheap job. And if you've got more money, you paid the expensive job. So you could go on a sliding scale. And she did what everyone else did at the time, which is say that she'd had super famous clients. She claimed to have seen Marie Antoinette, which sounds a little bit on the unlikely side, but okay, fair enough. She also claimed that she'd done a consultation for the Prince of Wales, which is more possible. And as she got caught under the Vagrancy Act, as most prominent astrologers did in the end, so she came out and put an advert saying that she was no longer an astrologer, she couldn't practice anymore. She was now selling her Bacvanian tincture, which would cure all ills for use for a variety of purposes. And when you came to buy it, you could have a free astrology lesson or you could talk about astrology with her. But she wasn't a practicing astrologer anymore. She just happened to be talking about it when you went and bought this bottle of nothingness, probably. So she carried on to her death. I can't remember when she. It was very late. She died in 1810, so she was really big in the last 20 years of the 18th century.
I love that ingenuity. You see, this is the Maverick free spirit that I was talking about when we first
Mm.
started. That's so alive. And you know, the ingenuity. Okay, you're going to stop me practicing astrology that way. Fine. I'm just going to do something else. We're going to have a bottle of something for you. And but hey, you can come and talk to me about astrology.
Yeah, she was also in quite a safe position because she was so well known, so famous that she wasn't the sort of person that the police were going to bother chasing all the time. There'd have been too much kickback. Those sort of astrologers actually weren't threatened very much by the Vagrancy Act. It was the middling ones, because again, the ones on the bottom end, no one was interested. They weren't making enough money or bothering anyone enough, so they were okay as well. It was the ones in the middle that were making a bit of a steady income, and people thought were being a nuisance. They're the ones who were in trouble.
Mm. Yes, that's and it, you know that's I think it's one of those things that we all need to remember. Because if we take that wheel of fortune, um, and we think about how things can turn very, very quickly, one way or another in society, it's something that we all need to remember, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna. I was gonna talk about someone else, but since you've led in like that, I'm gonna jump forward a little bit because it fits a bit better with the flow. In that, as you probably know, there have been campaigns against astrologers over the years. There were a couple of huge ones. They tended to be London-based, though. So in Britain, and in the US they had them as well, but they'd be state-based. But the British ones were very much London-based. So although you'll see history is saying there was a big clampdown of astrologers, it actually often means there was a big clampdown of astrologers who happened to hang around Bond Street, which isn't quite all astrologers. It was very contained. But there was a huge one in 1912. This is one of the biggest campaigns we'd ever had. And people had to remove words like astrologer or palmist or clairvoyant, anything that may be vaguely connected from any signs, because they used to have signs in the windows, and you'd have sandwich board men touting custom for people who'd got rented offices, and they were no longer allowed, adverts weren't allowed, all this sort of stuff. And there was a bit of puzzlement in some of the provincial newspapers. So, you know, these people have always been there. Why is it suddenly such an issue? Because nothing had really changed that much. And suddenly in 1912, this is a big problem. And it took a bit of digging, but I realized it's because there was one man that made it a problem. So basically, the whole campaign converged around him. All this astrologers are evil and you might get into trouble came round him. His name we don't actually know. The last name he went by was Rupert Gale, who's a black Jamaican. And just in case that didn't make him stand out enough, he dressed to the nines. He over the top dressed. The articles about him in newspapers spend much longer talking about what he was wearing than anything else. There are just loads of descriptions about which hat he's got on, his pince nez, like he's got a lovely cravat or whatever he had on. So he obviously dressed to the nines all the time. And he'd first been convicted of fortune telling at the end of 1911, which is when some of the um, information about what he was actually up to started coming to light, which is why I said the campaign was in 1912. And he'd been in London for quite a while. Like I said, he said he was Jamaican. He said what his name was. but we don't actually know where he came from. He probably did travel from Jamaica, but that doesn't mean Jamaica was his starting point. He could have come from practically anywhere. And he used 20 or 30 different names during his lifetime, so it's not clear what his name was, not even what his first name was. So we don't actually know who he was. But by the time the 1912 clampdown against astrologers came up, he'd already been convicted for keeping prostitutes. He'd also been convicted of actually having a brothel, because what he used to do is rent houses, open as brothels, and then move on when the locals started to complain and people started to notice. But he was a bit silly in that he rented houses from a magistrate, which obviously went completely wrong. So like he ended up in front of the magistrate's bench with that magistrate actually overseeing the case, which I don't think they'd be allowed to do nowadays. It was all very peculiar. And when he got arrested, we know he was an astrologer. One of the times he's arrested, he says, "My stars don't seem to be very lucky today, do they?" So he was.
I'm sorry, I'm trying not to laugh because I don't want to
This is
interrupt
only
you.
half of it. You wouldn't believe before.
I've got tears in my eyes.
But he was called a phrenologist, and a clairvoyant and a palm and various other things. But when you dig into what he was actually doing, when you look at the longer reports about it, there's mentions of star sheets, there's mentions of planets and everything. And he may well have done other things alongside, but he certainly practiced astrology. There's absolutely no doubt. And he may have done a lot of sun sign astrology, because there are some mentions that make it clear it was quick and dirty astrology and it was very cheap. But there are other mentions that make it clear that he did full horoscopes, full horoscope readings. So he obviously knew what he was doing. And he also, like I said, he stood out like nobody's business. He was quite short as well, so he was a particularly short, well-dressed black man who came from Jamaica. I mean, you could spot him, let's be fair. And every time he ended up in court, he'd make a big point of mentioning something about how he knew the English weren't racist and they treated black people as well as whites. So everyone got really embarrassed. And it meant that his initial sentences, because he was sentenced several times, were a lot shorter than they should have been for the crimes, because nobody wanted to look racist. These people were being so polite. So he got away with a lot because of telling people he knew they didn't want to be racist. And we could spend an hour, honestly. It just gets worse. He married a 17-year-old client, and then she found him in bed with her maid. And so they had a fight. And she left him when her companion, she had a paid companion, who was charged with committing suicide after she was pregnant by Rupert, who by then was being called Dr. Blair for some reason, best known to himself. And he said it wasn't a problem because he was happy to pay the child. And apparently that's what he did. So although it was all very unpleasant and everything, it turned out okay in the end. There was some dodgy things he did with some woman. He got involved with her bonds. The solicitor got her money back. He was trying to scam her out of money, but he completely failed on that one. The implication is he probably succeeded with someone else. This is just one occasion he was caught. And in Ireland, he was actually accused of having run a white slave trade, but it did sound like they were getting a little bit overexcited because there wasn't any indication. Nobody was with him unwillingly. All these young girls had agreed to be with him. So, like, this is a bit, but they were very young. They were as young as 14. He was hiring 13 and 14-year-old girls. On the other hand, at this time, 13 and 14-year-old girls were part of the market they were working. So it's not as sleazy as it would sound in modern terms. He was actually paying them to do work like answer the door and introduce clients and things like that. He wasn't just keeping them, for entertainment. And for some reason, again, best known to himself, he pays, yeah, there's one point here where one of the girls actually said that her job comprised dusting the office and sitting there while he read novels to her. He paid her to sit still while he read books to her, which sounds like quite a pleasant job, actually, but she only lasted a few days. He decided to tell everyone he was Indian towards the end of his active period, which people quite happily believed. That it
He,
just it got worse. There's just more and more of it. We could go on for days.
um, I know we don't have an official name for him, so I imagine it's too much to hope that we even know what sign he was.
We don't, well, we only know approximately what year he was born in. We can't even be more categorical than that. And that's only because he was arrested when he first arrived in London. So there are records of his approximate age from very early on, and then he gave an age on the census. Well, not the 1939 register, because there was no census because the war coming up, but there was a register. So we know approximately when he was born, and we know that he claimed to be born in Jamaica. But other than that, I've got a note here saying when he last got his last arrest was in 1934. And by then, he'd been charged 34 times, and he spent a total of 11 years of his life in prison.
Wow.
It was in
Um,
and out all the
yeah,
time. And that's why we had campaigns against astrology. It wasn't anything to
yeah.
do with astrology. It was a small number of, actually, I don't think there was another one of him. There couldn't
No,
be.
I was just thinking about, what you said, where one person suddenly leads to a desire to have a purge. And, it seems that one of the more common ones is the prediction of the death of somebody famous. Uh,
Mm.
that seems to lead people to get. I think there was one of the popes now. It's escaping me now which one, where there was a prediction made against him. That he might be dying soon, and I think he did. And subsequently, astrology became public enemy number one. And that does
Yeah,
occasionally
yeah,
happen.
that happens. Except by the time the main period I've been looking at, people weren't taking the predictions in such a serious way. So it wasn't so politically worrying. It was more
No,
social worrying, if you see what I mean. But also they were very worried um, by odd people being astrologers. I mean, Rupert, who I've been talking about, is certainly odd, but there were, but oh, pardon, something's gone down the wrong way. But there were much older ones in the same period, because it brings my absolute favourite one to research is another one. We don't know who it was. We still don't know who this person was. But basically, in 1915, a woman knocked at the door of that house collecting for charity, which isn't a big deal, but it happened to be a policeman's house, and it sounded like he was a generally suspicious man anyway. So he asked her who she was and does she have her papers, because you needed to show some sort of identity. Even then, you had to show some form of ID to show who you were collecting for. And pardon me, she looked a bit dodgy, so he arrested her for begging. They went to her home, as they do, went to check out, and found there was a sign there which said she was an astronomy, astrologer, and a recorder and clairvoyant, which is all very good. Lots of mystical books about, but it sounds like they've got copies of Raphael's Zadkiel and nothing amazing. And then the newspapers went along to have a look, and they got quite interested in it. And then it made the press, because when she was arrested and taken in, it became obvious very quickly, and it's obvious in the photographs, that she wasn't a she at all. She was a man wearing women's clothes. That everyone seemed to, everyone locally, well, that's okay. They called her Rosie. She lived in Nottingham, and everyone locally knew her. And obviously, they weren't stupid. They knew this was a man in women's clothes, but they just thought Rosie likes to wear dresses. Well, there's the thing. I mean, that would have been enough, except that she also wore short skirts in 1915 rather than long skirts. and painted her face. I don't mean she put lipstick on and whatever, because that would just be dressing up as a woman. She stained her face with something that covered it, coloured it a copper colour, it's described. So basically, as if she'd been on a over the top sunbed. That's the image you got. She gave herself a really strong suntan look. And then told a story in court about how she was Serbian. She gave a Serbian name and she'd come over with her father years ago and all this sort of stuff. And there was no way of checking that. And it was a bit of a bad move because Serbians weren't particularly popular just before the First World War. So you thought, what? Why didn't you say you were practically anything else, Danish or something? And people was going, oh yeah, that's interesting. But no, certainly. So that made people a bit more suspicious. Anyway, because she was a little bit on the bad side, she was sent to be examined by doctors. You know, is she saying that this is not the same person because they dressing up in the wrong gender and everything? And so everyone's chagrin, the report came back from the doctors, which basically said, yeah, she's a little bit on the weird side, but she's absolutely, completely, and utterly. So this person is completely sane. They are odd. It literally said she's an odd person, but yeah, the doctor said there's nothing wrong with her, and she said she left the court. Come on, thank you very much. That was quite nice of you. Very polite, apparently. And then she would have disappeared, and we would have known nothing more of her. Except a couple of years later, got arrested again, but by now was claiming to be a Philippine priest, which was a bit confusing for everyone, and was still dressed as a woman. So she was using a man's name and claiming to be Filipino and saying she was a priest while wearing women's clothes. So obviously everyone got quite confused about this. But it was less wasn't it was slightly bothersome that she was being a woman, but not in a sort of that's terrible mention dress as women. It's like, what are you doing? Who are you? What is all this about? In that sort of way, everyone was bemused by it. But there is no doubt that although there are other ways of making money that are recorded, she'd taken on a certain way, and she made at the second time. I do tend to call her she because everyone did and called her Rosie. So I think it's fair to call her she. She likes that. Um, she definitely practiced astrology. She advertised astrology and the records of her doing it, but it was downplayed in court, as it would be, because she wasn't going to say, oh yes, I make a living from doing this illegal thing, when everyone was a bit bothered about her being there anyway. And she in fact got in more trouble for not having the correct papers, which I had in court the second time because she'd said she was Serbian. As I said earlier, that wasn't a wise idea. And we got to the point where a Serbian without papers was someone who was going to get the interest of the police. So she'd made a real fundamental error in claiming to be Serbian and not having what I can't remember what it was called, the equivalent of a visa to be in Britain at that time. So that caused the bother. But it all got sorted out in the end because it sounds like everyone got too confused to work out actually what to do with them. Like, on balance, she wasn't really bothering anyone that much. She was just reading people's charts and selling a few kitchen things. So they just sent her home. And we still don't know who she was.
No, it's
Pardon me.
yeah, I mean, it's always the danger, isn't it, in society that it's not necessarily that you're doing harm. It's the fact that you stand out and can become the focus of negative attention.
I think there is a slight difference between standing out because you look different and standing out like Rosie, who I've just been talking about, did, because I mean, this was someone who wanted to stand out. There's no doubt
Oh
about
yes,
it.
absolutely. But as you say, deemed to be of no, of no real interest, as in not actually doing any harm. And I think that's the thing is, some people like to stand out because they like to be bold and they like to be
Yeah.
noticed, but sometimes that is a risky business.
I mean, there's the next one I was going to talk about is she's an Indian woman who was a huge celebrity in the 1920s, and we managed to forget again. Um, she was known as Princess Sunita, which obviously she wasn't a princess, and Sunita wasn't a name, but that's not really important. But she'd ended up in Britain for the Wembley exhibition in 1924 and just not gone home. And it's quite a long story because she ended up being an artist model. She was the model for the sculptor Jacob Epstein, so she became really well known for that. And if you're the sort of person who likes looking up sculptors, I mean, he's a really interesting one, had a very odd lifestyle. So, of course, as soon as he met her, he moved her into his house with his wife and her kid. And it was all very odd and too complicated to explain now. But the really important thing, she started off by being a dancer, and she also worked with Jasper Masculine, the stage magician. But she kind of the best way for her to make money was to tour the provinces and interpret people's sun signs on the stage. So the way it worked is that you'd have an audience and she'd go, does anyone want to ask me anything? This wasn't doing clairvoyant readings, it was more direct questions. And someone would, oh, I was born in August and I'm having a problem with my dog, or whatever their thing was. And she'd go, oh, okay, you're a Leo, and that's because this night next year is going to be like that for you. And she literally did that for most of her performance. And she made some more definite predictions, mainly political and social sort of predictions, or something that would get printed in the press. So she'd do that as part of her acts and say it on stage. And apparently she was very good at predicting horse racing, to the extent that when she was in Dublin, the Association of Bookmakers, I can't remember what it was called, but there was a group, sort of union of bookmakers, set up a campaign to have her banned because her predictions, horse races, were too good. So although she was known for doing sun sign work, she had to be doing more detailed astrology than that to come up with these sort of predictions. It's implied you're not going to be predicting horse race, specific races, and the results by just doing sun sign stuff. And she sold a book where you could return a coupon. The book just gave you your sun sign delineations, and then there'd be a sort of, if you'd like to know more or get a personalized reading, you can send, and pardon me, since it's gone down the wrong way, you can send in this coupon with whatever it was, 2 and 6pence, and you can have a full reading of your chart. And that's why she ended up in court, because that clearly contravenes the Vagrancy Act. But she's also interesting because she was a celebrity astrologer at the point when women's magazines were just starting to feature astrology in them. So obviously she was asked to write for the magazines. Whether she lent her name to the columns or wrote them herself is debatable. But there were some pieces that looked like she probably did write them. And she had her fictionalized life story published, which is a common thing with celebrity fortune tellers, astrologers, clairvoyants, whichever. And she appeared regularly in a lot of magazines. She died in 1932, just before astrology completely exploded in the 1930s. So she just missed making that progression from being a sort of celebrity known at her time, being a real superstar, because she probably would have gone the next step because she was already so well known at that point. And newspapers and magazines were giving work to anyone they could find that was already known, that already had a reputation for doing astrology. She just missed the window, unfortunately. But she was very famous, like really well known. Lots of photos of her in the newspapers. The equivalent of Heat magazine going around to sort of snap her coming in and out of events. Literally, she had pictures taken because she went to lunch with someone important. So, I mean, this was happening, and we forgot all about her because she didn't. Again, she only wrote one book which doesn't appear to exist. I've never been able to trace a copy, and she didn't always say she was doing astrology, but her columns were about life predictions and things like that. And they clearly were, if you read them, they were astrological. There's no doubt about it. But the word astrology wasn't attached to them. So she sort of, again, she falls through the cracks. We've lost reference to her.
Wow. It's I'm always fascinated about the research that you're doing into the wonderful world that is the world of astrology. You start off going in one direction, and then you discover all these neat little alleys that take you in.
There's so many.
Yes, and I find that absolutely fascinating. And thank you. I cannot wait for you to get this into a book. Uh,
It will happen, believe me. It has to, there's too much of it now just to leave it sitting on my computer.
I just can't wait for that. And in the meantime, I will recommend that everybody finds the book that you wrote on the history, of sun sign astrology. And I would putting the link to that in the description box, because it is an absolutely brilliant book for people to discover. And if people want to find you, Kim, how do they do that?
I'm not difficult to find at all. You could put my email address up if you want to do that, if people want to email me direct.
I will do that. I'll put that in the description
Yeah.
box as well. And as speaking of description boxes, I will be putting a link to the Lightways channel on Rumble as well. Just a reminder, as a nice backup in case anything happens to this channel because of algorithms doing weird and wonderful things, you will know where to find me. So until next time, next time we're going to be looking at astrology and characterology and the human field. Until then, goodbye.